Last time we covered the origin of the Lee-Enfield long rifle and how it stumbled through the Boer War. Now we'll consider the solution, an improved short rifle. Hi, I'm Othais, and this, there we go, this fits perfectly in frame because it is a short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark I. Star. We'll get to those 3 stars in a moment, but first, let's take a look at the light box. Weighing in at 8.5 pounds and 44.5 inch long, this is not what you would consider to be a super handy carbine, but it beats the pants off that long rifle. It still carries 10 rounds in the magazine, all of them .303. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with our show, this is the part where I take the thing we're supposed to talk about, put it down, and talk about something completely different but sort of related earlier in the history. So, from our last episode, we know that Britain was delayed in the race to repeating arms, and they held on to a single-shot black powder perhaps too long, or maybe they made the right call because they would ultimately adopt a technically superior Lee-Metford bolt-action rifle. There would be a series of updates until, after the adoption of a truly smokeless cartridge began ruining barrel life, a new pattern of rifling was released. This resulted in the Lee-Enfield Mark I. This too would see some minor modification and updated model numbers. All of the previous models would ultimately end up receiving their first real combat in the Second Boer War. Now, this is a show about firearms history, not political history, but we do kind of have to cover both on occasion in order to spell out what's going on. And I don't want to leave everybody completely in the dark about what a Boer War is, so let's go very quickly and very shallowly through what this conflict entails. I recommend a lot of extra reading if you really care. But basically, you have Dutch and British settlers in the southern part of Africa. And then following the Napoleonic Wars, Britain starts administering the area. Now, the Dutch don't really care for this, so they move further inland and establish 2 free states, literally an Orange Free State, and then the South African Republic. And things go okay for them because they're not really on the valuable coast until they actually discover things like gold and diamonds, at which point the British become interested again. And then you see an attempt to move British citizens in the area and then force an annex around 1880. This is a big problem, kicking off the First Boer War. The British were defeated and both states remained sovereign. But, like I said, gold and diamonds. And the South African Republic was especially short-handed for the available resource wealth. They reluctantly would let in more English-speaking immigrants. This opened an opportunity to potentially annex the wealthy region and would, ultimately, result in the botched Jameson Raid of 1895. This only made relations worse, especially since the Boer would turn over the British prisoners only to see them receive a slap on the wrist for their attempted coup. Alright, so you've fled the British once, and then the British keep coming, and then at some point you realize you actually need somebody to dig holes, so okay, we'll let some British in, but we're not letting them vote because every time we do, they try to take over our colony. Now, the British Empire is saying, whoa, those are British people and you're not letting them vote? That's messed up, man. We're going to have to do something about this. And so they start this really hard politic military push, and you're going, you guys are just trying to get all our gold and diamonds. And then it becomes this sort of back and forth argument, and you know that soldiers are massing on the border, and this is getting to be a point where they're just going to justify another military incursion into your space. So, why not provide the best defense possible? And in October of 1899, the Boers would attack the British first, and they'd meet with some good success. Now, this isn't a series on the Second Boer War, so I'm going to crunch the rest of this down. The British would take a few swings at restoring order with mixed results. The effectiveness of the Dutch South Africans was pretty much a surprise to the British. Well, to the British who weren't paying attention. You see, at this point in the Empire's history, the army had shrunk considerably. It was underfunded compared to the Navy because that's where all the power was. I mean, when we think of this old empire, we think of a naval empire. And so that's a lot of the reason why small arms, land small arms, dragged along. And we saw in our previous episode that the Navy was the force that kept kind of kicking it back into motion. Well, here we finally have a land conflict against what should be a much smaller and weaker enemy, and we're getting trounced. So it's time to finally pay a little attention to reorganizing and especially re-equipping the army. And by the end of 1900, you are going to see the British firmly back in control of all of their possessions and pretty much overrunning all of the African possessions. That, however, did not end the conflict because there would be 2 more years. All the way up until May of 1902, you're going to see guerrilla fighting by the local Boers. They were a determined people. Now, this caused a number of problems with ways of dealing with scorched earth policies on the civilian populace, the British using blockhouses and other checkpoints to try to control movement in the region, and some pretty terrifying things done with prisoners and rails. It is a conflict that ultimately damaged the reputation of the empire internationally, and so when they settled the matter, they settled it on surprisingly equitable terms, considering that the British really did control the region at that point and were slowly and decisively wiping out the Boers. So ultimately, you end up with a state that is, yes, British controlled, but has a fair amount of autonomy and self-rule, at least for that time with that sort of overwhelming victory, which honestly should have been a model for a later conflict, but wasn't. And there's a lot we can learn from history, folks, but that's not our story today. Now, before anybody starts leaving comments that was just too shallow of an understanding, believe me, I've read a lot more about the Boers. The problem is, this isn't a show about them. This is a show about the effect they had on the British Army, and especially their rifles. So, in that conflict, the best we've got is this, the Long Lee. Well, it seems majestic, don't get me wrong. It seems very advanced with its detachable magazine and 10-round capacity, especially centered on the gun like that, was extraordinary for the time. And honestly, it is a good advanced rifle, but there would be a lot of problems that cropped up in this specific conflict with this specific gun. And moreover, we saw how long and slow a slog it was to get this gun ready and adopted and then played with over and over again. Well, this finally put some pressure on the institution that was the British Army and Land Forces to actually get some adoptions done because they didn't want to look like fools in front of a smaller opponent again. Fighting on the African veldt was a new experience all around. The land was open with low rolling hills for miles, so high visibility, little cover, and plenty of chances to set up high ground advantages. This ultimately favors long-range marksmanry and cavalry maneuvering. As we saw last episode, the Lee-Metford and Lee-Enfield long rifles had severe problems when it came to accurate fire, as their sights and bedding just were not in order for this sort of range. While these could be and were addressed by simple changes in manufacture and testing, there were additional problems. Like we covered last time, that's going to set these guns up for adjustable front sights and better testing coming out of the factory to make sure that they're lined up properly. It would also invite this sort of need for more adjustable sights, especially windage. And research on that front would begin right away with these long guns. And a number of designs were worked up to be fitted to these guns, and then not adopted because, well, as we'll see, they ran in a different direction in the long run. Those tests, however, would result in the appropriate windage adjustable rear sight for the charger loading modifications of these guns. So in other words, that research would be dusted off and applied later on when they went ahead and upgraded these guns just before World War I. The Second Boer War also gave the British their first taste of the new sensational rifle sweeping the globe, the Mauser. In this case, it was one of the variants from the 1893 family of Mauser rifles, the same family that would inspire the US to drop the Krag. These guns were flat-shooting, highly accurate, finely sighted, quick-loading, and extremely rugged, and they were outpacing the Lee by a fair margin. Now, wisely, the British weren't too proud to ignore an enemy defeated power's superior small arm, and so they would take a hard look at the Mauser and a hard look at their own gun and see what improvements could be made. While only 1.5 inches shorter, the Mauser was a pound lighter. Its internal magazine was less likely to be damaged than the Lee's, which honestly had been built lightly so that you could have a spare, but then they never used that feature. The Mauser also had an improved 2-stage trigger to the Lee's single stage. The bolt was easier to disassemble down to the firing pin, And having all that ammo in stripper clips meant faster loading than just having a magazine that you can single load. And even if you did get that second magazine like they had intended and then abandoned, stripper clips are still faster once you burn out more than 20 rounds. Alright, we got some room for improvement there, that's for sure. While we're looking at our gun and deciding whether to improve or replace it, let's ask some harder questions too while we're at it. So, are we keeping the .303 cartridge? Yes, apparently we are. Are we keeping the magazine cut off? For some ungodly reason, yes, we're doing that too. Alright, should we shorten it? That sounds kind of handy. That has some merit. And then finally, they even would go so far as to say, what about an autoloader? Which was still very early days for an autoloader. We're talking about 1900 to 1902. There's nothing that acceptable for military service at that point, and we're not entirely made of money. I mean, we're startled by the power of the Mauser, but we're not about to freak out. So, let's go back to the drawing board just a bit, but play it a little more conservatively. We don't want to throw out the baby with the dirty, horrible bathwater. So, this gun had been brought about by the work of James Paris Lee and Joseph Speed. Well, one of those names is going to stick around. But we've already talked about him, so let's talk about our other player, Colonel Henry Samuel Spiller Watkin, who I don't have a photo of, I'm sorry. Born into a military family in India, he would follow with tradition by enrolling at the Royal Military Academy. Post-graduation, he would rise through the ranks, making Deputy Director of Artillery in 1878. He would go on to be Assistant Superintendent to the Royal Gunpowder Factory, Waltham, in 1881, and Chief Inspector of Position Finding in 1886. Most importantly, today, he would serve as Superintendent of Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, from 1899 until, presumably, his passing in 1905. I had a hard time looking this guy up. Now, Watkin, by the way, not Watkins, Watkin, and I'm sure I'm going to get that wrong like I do a lot of things. Let me just, there we go. Alright, so Watkin would apparently work hands-on with Speed. I say apparently because I've seen in a number of sources Watkin cited as being directly involved in having his own patents, but at the same time, I also noticed that his name is on top of Speed's and a number of patents and being superintendent. It may just be that he's signing off on them because he's a superintendent, but regardless, let's just give him some credit because he oversaw this process, alright? So, we're doing away with the original rifle. We don't know yet whether we're doing a short rifle or anything like that. We just know we got to make some changes. And so a lot of these ideas would be sort of gathered up and placed into one test bed, which would be the improved Lee-Enfield rifle. And then later that gun was going to get turned into the modified rifle, which is just the same sort of general ideas, but extra stuff being tried out. Basically, we're slapping on all the best ideas to the existing system and seeing what floats. This gun, which appeared somewhere around mid-1900, had a focus on rapid loading, improved and finely adjustable sighting, and lessening the weight down to about 8 pounds, 6 ounces, without yet shortening the gun. As you can tell, it would prove pretty influential. Key features include a nose cap, which also sported a front sight protector that wrapped all the way around the sight, over top. An easier to disassemble bolt, a windage adjustable rear sight, full-length handguard, charger loading action, and 2-stage trigger. Now that drawing is a freeze frame of one particular rifle at one particular time. Like I said, they are going to try a mix of parts left and right. They're going to play with sight radius. Everything's in the air at this point. They're just looking at what sticks. So, one of the things that they would additionally test, let me get this out of the way for just a moment. One of the things they would additionally test is loading systems, because just because the Mauser used a stripper clip, that doesn't mean that the stripper clip is the superior system in the world at that time. And so they start looking at a number of different dump loading systems, one of which happened to be the Harris, and we happen to have seen it on another rifle at another point in history. Now, this is most of a Ross rifle Mark II. As you'll see in a second, there's a few bits and bobs that need to be found or repaired, but it has the things that we care about. So let's take a closer look at what I'm talking about when I say they were thinking about a dump magazine. So, if you look, and we don't want to pay too much attention to this gun, I know you guys get excited about Rosses, that's not what we're here for today. But if we look at it closely, we're going to see we have a follower that we can control with a big old fancy button. Well, actually it's a sheet steel button, but anyway, it's a good button to me. So the idea here is that you would take this and hold it down, lowering the follower. Then you would take your loose ammo and these are deactivated, don't worry guys. You'd take your loose ammo and you just sort of blah, and then let go. And it would work perfectly every time. Obviously this was widely adopted and everybody loved it, and it was not just used on one horrifying gun with its own horrifying history. No. Anyway, moving on, we would stick with the stripper clip system. This, again, was a joint venture for Speed and Watkin, presumably. Unlike our later Charger bridge, this was a nib set on the receiver and a sliding notch set on the bolt head. At the same time, we can see the earliest version of the 303 clip. I should also explain the move to a two-stage trigger. You see, the original rifle had a direct trigger and sear relationship. Pull trigger, tip sear, one continuous action. Now because this is a military rifle and soldiers are prone to, well, anything, a heavier trigger is fitted to avoid accidents. But that direct, heavy trigger pull introduces some potential inaccuracy. The two-stage trigger was shaped so that the shooter could take up the heavy weight of the now safer trigger pull to a point right before a lighter, crisper break. When used properly, this helped mitigate muscle tension influencing accuracy, but still provided the safety of a heavy pull. And because it's on the same patent, let's talk about this single-piece nose cap and sight protector. On this design, the muzzle ring from the bayonet was moved to rest below the barrel, keeping it from overtly influencing the point of impact for the rifle when the bayonet was fixed. This neatly solves a problem that we've seen addressed in other odd ways. These early nose caps would have full sight protectors, wrapped all the way over the top of the front sight. Here, I need to take a step back and make one thing clear. At this time, the British were also developing a new carbine to replace the Mark I. But the biggest complaints against the carbines had more to do with the overall design rather than any one or two features. These short-barreled guns did not get a full burn on the 303 cartridge, lowering the muzzle velocity. And with barrel-mounted sights, that radius was pretty well reduced, not ideal at all. The basic gist of that is that the cavalry carbine was not cutting it on the veldt. And at the same time, the infantry weren't too happy with their gun. Accuracy problems aside, it's still big and heavy, and so you are forced to march for quite a while with a honkin' rifle. Or you're forced to get on and off of train cars, crowded in with your mates, banging into each other with an awful giant rifle. This thing ain't working for anybody. Well, on the plus side, that makes our situation easier to solve because the cavalry are basically asking for a longer carbine and the infantry are asking for a shorter rifle. And that puts us in a position to go, you know, can we just meet in the middle and make one gun for everybody? Because that would simplify a lot. Now, I understand the one downside of this is that if you have a cavalry carbine, you really don't want to fit a bayonet, not at that time. But half the time, and we are not doing an episode on the carbines yet, half the time you end up just fitting bayonets to the carbines anyway so you can issue them to pseudo-police units and other forces. And so it ultimately comes down to, is it really going to be that big of a bother to have a little nub on the end of there when you don't want to have a bayonet? Or maybe you could just have a nice bayonet because they're nice anyway. So the short rifle concept makes good sense. The trick is, does it work practically? Well, the officials that be would go ahead and take a long rifle, shorten it back by 5 inches, and pump some rounds out to see if it made a big whoop. When the gunpowder cleared, which was very quickly because this was smokeless, there was no whoop to be found. Ballistically, it just didn't matter. The shortened rifle was found to be just as accurate out to 1,000 yards as the current issue long rifle. But for the cavalry, they found the balance and accuracy much improved over their existing carbines. So by January of 1901, they knew that they were heading towards a universal short rifle to be adopted, and a number of good ideas, as we've been slowly covering bit by bit, are starting to amalgamate into one design. So what's really left to consider here? Well, most of those questions would be addressed on a new pair of experimental short rifles. These would be referred to as A and B and were assembled sometime in late 1901. Before I go any further, there's an earlier A and B for barrel testing. Briefly mention them in a moment. The key difference between these two would be the rear sight. The A would have one, well, we're going to see in a minute, not giving too much away there, and the B's would resemble, well, basically what was later fitted to the Charger loading Lee-Enfield. Both guns would lack a magazine cutoff, but due to naval concerns, the available space for one was left on the receivers. Additionally, butt traps and piling swivels were omitted, but we know they will return. These new guns also did away with the dust cover and used full-length steel-reinforced handguards and had bead-style front sights instead of those old barleycorns. The front sight protectors were still fully enclosing the front sight. They also sported a new safety which would come from Lee and Watkin. This left side lever is similar to the original Metford, but with an evolved mechanism. Its half turn causes the unit to screw into the receiver, locking both the cocking piece and bolt in place. You can also see this patent covers the interior barrel bands fitted to the later short Lee-Enfield rifles. These were created to center and hold the barrel, but allow room for heat expansion to avoid disrupting point of impact. While they work, it's a bit odd because the same overall effect can be achieved with a stepped barrel. Now, comparing from a Mauser, the British really don't have an excuse to not understand stepped barrels. They were clearly aware of them. But they had an obsession going on with skinny barrels. As a matter of fact, there were an earlier two carbines that I mentioned that had test barrels fitted and different sights as well. This is just experimental stuff all over the place, but part of the test was that one of them had a regular thickness Lee-Enfield barrel for that time, and the other one had one that had been turned down much thinner to see if there was any real difference in performance. And of course, there would have been a minor one in terms of once they started to cook up and expand, especially depending on how they were bedded. And we know that the step barrel works fine for dealing with this, and we also now know that you can use a weird collar and screw with a spring to allow the same effect, but that seems kind of complicated unless you're really trying to save barrel weight and profile. But then you have to wonder about the weight of adding the screw and the spring. I'm really not sure of this decision, guys, and I'm sure somebody will write in with much more detail, but I was unable to find it. On the plus side, both systems still beat the pants off of a barrel jacket. Turning back to our A and B pattern carbines that I drew nice pictures of, these guys would be produced just over 1,000 and sent out for trials here and there with various dirts and dum-dums and see what turned up. Now, three big things would come away from that. One, they're going to go with a steel butt plate. Two, that front bead sight is going back to the old barleycorn. I don't know if they were breaking them or couldn't understand, put the round thing on the round thing. Barleycorn it is forever and not quite always, as we'll see in a moment. And then third on that list, we're going to see that that front sight hood that went all the way over, it wasn't letting enough light in, so we just trimmed that back. There we go, that's fine. Because of the new muzzle arrangement, a new bayonet was necessary. The pommel had to be swapped out for sure, but the question came down to, do we need a longer bayonet to offset our shorter rifle? And so 12 and 17-inch versions were considered, with the 12 ultimately being selected and becoming the model 1903. Now at this point, overall, both guns are doing well in the trials. I mean, you're thinking about your infantry saving 5 inches and 1.5 pounds, they're happy because the performance is still there. And your cavalry, well, they're getting 4.5 inches back practically at the cost of maybe 0.5 pound because these are dedicated lightened rifles. This is looking really good, so we better make sure we stir the pot and find at least one problem to whine about because the old guys are not going to be happy until there's something wrong with this new fangled jiggery-joo. And so we're going to see that that comes down to the fact that if you have a shorter barrel, you're going to lose just a little bit of muzzle velocity, which apparently is so devastating despite the lack of effect on actual aiming or impact. We need to address it. So Watkin would come forward with a solution of sorts. This is progressive depth rifling, and I quote the patent, "I bore the barrel from the charge chamber about 1/3 of its length cylindrical, and rifle that part of it to uniform depth. I make the rest of the barrel a bore of slightly larger diameter, and the rifling slightly deeper, preferably increasing in depth towards the muzzle." Now to translate that to dumb Othais speak, the barrel stays parallel in terms of both rifling height and depth to a point, and then it starts to expand, both. So in other words, the tops of the rifling get further apart, and the depths of the rifling get further apart, therefore deeper, and that somehow helps with muzzle velocity. I'm sure someone who's better versed in physics could explain this to me. I don't think it's going to be all that important, as we'll see later on. Now, going back to the trials, the Type A sight will win, and we're going to see a variant of it in just a few minutes. And overall, we're doing pretty well, but there's still, again, little tweaks. So by December of 1902, they would roll out one more improved short rifle. It featured an adjustable barleycorn front sight. a deeper magazine with a different spring to ease the clip loading. The charger guides were tightened up a bit. Thanks to some pushing from the Navy and other special units, the magazine cutoff was back. It had a solid steel butt plate with no trap, and the rear sight had an elevation adjusting screw for 50-yard increments, but no windage dial. Plus, they fiddled with the rear sight protectors mounted on the handguard. All of that would be bundled up and approved in December of 1902 as the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark I. But that would require a little bit of a take back because they were having problems with screws shaking loose and other fittings. They had to go back and just tweak a few things, stake some stuff. And notably, they added back in the long-range dial volley sight. So that ultimately brings us to the true reintroduction in 1903 of the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark I. Now, a true Mark I is a very rare treat because of all the updates done to them. As a matter of fact, this is a Mark I star, 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 triple star. And each of those stars means that there's a revision to the pattern and an update to the gun. In this case, the only big difference between this and the original Mark I is that the sights had been updated for Mark VII ammo, and they were given a U-notch and a front sight blade instead of the barleycorn and V-notch. So instead of like a pyramid and a V, I've got a slot and a U. That's it, guys. Other little things have been sort of upgraded or tweaked on this gun as it was repaired over the years, but nothing else is standing out, so I think this will do just fine for us to walk through the first short magazine Lee-Enfield. So let's take a closer look. There is a lot going on here to talk about, but first of all, let's discuss our similarities. So we have a 10-round detachable box magazine. There's our detachable right there. Same system. We have our rear locking bolt. Same system, same locking point, same cock on close. We have our, let me flip it over the other way. We have our rear aperture volley sight, dial sight, and our dial plate up here. All good there, guys, familiar? What's new is the short length and iconic nose cap. Now, this looks a bit different from the later Mark III that I'm sure you're all remembering. Look how tight we are down in here. Let me get my pokey hand. Patented plastic. All right, so a little narrow in there, but still open top to let in more light. These originally would have had what's called a barleycorn front sight, which, Google it up, guys. And then was later replaced with a blade like this one. And if you'll notice, our muzzle ring for our bayonet rests on this plug right here, not on the actual muzzle. And our lugs down here. This guy has a cut in him because he is not a sling swivel, but a piling swivel. You interlock these in order to keep your rifles upright and out of the mud, making your rifle teepee. Now, as I get to the rear, we can see the major change in this gun, which is clip loading. As I retract the bolt, pay attention to this guy who is mounted on the bolt head and this little thick wall of the receiver, which is a dead giveaway that a gun used to have one of these. So as I pull it rearward, it's going to contact and whoop, go forward, creating this pathway for a stripper clip. Now, Mae will show you how that works later if you can't figure it out. But that's it. So obviously this is a pretty crazy wear part because as I go back forward, it again has to reset rearward. And that's just, I mean, that's just wobbling on this. Anyway, we'll talk more about him in a minute, but at least it gave a way for the older system to be updated. Now, obviously, all they did was mill out the path on the other side. That's static. All right, follow me so far. Good. Let's go talk about the rear sight. So, line her up where you can see. The rear sight is actually a little different from what we're probably used to with the Mark III. This has a 2-button pinch and slide tangent rear leaf. It also has a windage dial here, which can be read on the face of this. And then, if I can get her around to the side, it's going to be pretty small to see, but there are itty bitty, teeny tiny markings right here. This is so that you can have a up to 50-yard sort of half position walk for your distance alignment. So in other words, if I want to be in between 400 and 500 yards on this tangent sight, I can twist the knob, and I'm sorry guys, I'm trying to get this where you can see it. This knob under here can be twisted to raise and lower this last little portion of the sight so that you can walk it in even tighter than the 100-yard units. Now, this guy at the rear is the sight protector to keep it from getting bashed on the ground. This is mounted to the handguard, which makes it actually pretty easy to sort of just knock right off the gun. It's not the sturdiest thing in the world, despite being made out of metal and sticking up like that. So, one other unique feature to this gun, especially this gun that should excite a lot of you once you see it, is, let's just take her apart. So I'm going to pull this to the rear. We're going to pull up on this guy, and I'm going to try not to bend my fingernail. As I pull up on it, you see immediately we have this problem here, which is that now our little charger notch has smacked into the other side, so you then have to move him rearward mid flipping it up. I can't imagine how these things got damaged all the time, huh? So get him up out of the way and back. All right, so we'll move our gun to the side and look at our bolt. Now, the bolts for the Lee-Enfield usually require a special tool to go into the head and remove the firing pin. That was true for the old Metford, and that will be true again, as we'll see later in this episode. But in this one brief period, they emulated the Mauser in terms of being able to disassemble the bolt yourself without specialty tools. So there's a knob back here. It is not a screw. You just push and turn, like say 90 degrees. See how it's sticking out a little bit further now? So it is no longer engaging the firing pin. The bolt head is notched so as to actually grab the firing pin. So if I work this guy out, and I kind of felt it slip, so I don't think I'm grabbing it at the moment, but that's okay, I want to show you this. And I'm sure you guys can spare an extra minute or two. Let me get him out. See that notch right there? That can actually lip over the firing pin if you keep the pressure on it. So let me get her back in there. All right, she's in. We will decock the gun so that the firing pin can make contact with that notch. I'll twist her around to make sure she's got it. That's got her. And I'll start unscrewing. Now I have more tension because I am unscrewing the firing pin at the same time. This is probably making a lot of you who have Mark IIIs at home very jealous, because the rest of you have to get that stupid cylinder thing out that we'll see in a moment. I'll actually show a comparison when we get to the Mark III. So, oop, I think I lost her. Let me get her back down in there. There it is, I grabbed her. So let's just keep turning. Sorry for the time lapse, folks. Special trick, walk the cocking piece back a bit, screw this guy in more, let her forward. And that gets you the ability to keep unscrewing it carefully. I had basically walked out the firing pin, or walked out the head ahead of the firing pin because it takes more to get the firing pin out. So again, pull cocking piece back, thread in, let go of cocking piece, start threading out. That's going to get the final bit out for you. So now, boom, there we go. Sorry, bad memory, but we're there in the end. So check that out. Again, just a push and turn, and she clicks back into place. Push, pull and turn, and you've unlocked the firing pin to rotate. And the whole way we took that thing apart was just that interaction right there. Boy, I wish they had left this on these guns. Now, another changeover to these guns, and you know, can you tell Mae fires them before I get them? All right, so set that aside. Pick this guy up. Another change to this gun is going to come in the magazine. So let me get that out. And then I've gone ahead and taken a magazine out of our previous Lee-Enfield long rifle. This is something that required the re-release of our previous episode, although by now you guys have all seen the updated information. But let's do a comparison. So looking back in, here is our current mag that everybody's so familiar with. And we'll just pop that back and wiggle. There we go. And then we've got our nice spring. Ooh, flat spring. We're used to all this, right guys? Nothing amazing or wondrous here. Here's the diff though. On the previous model, which I've already taken apart because it takes a little bit more poking around, our previous follower had this set of eyelets and this particular spring, who I will worm out, right there, just that single curved leaf. So that guy clips into the front there, and then this guy rides, and then when it drops all the way down, and good old Ian has a video on these as well, that means the spring's up against the front. You don't have the body of the spring up under the bottom of the mag. So honestly, a decent system when you're, you know, doing a single stack or feeding one at a time, and this is a double stack, but It started with the single stack. Just fine for that, but by the time we get in these charger loaders, one thing we have to do is deepen up the magazine bottom a little bit, starting at the rear, and later they'll deepen the front, as we'll see. And two, look, this is just a better feed. We get much more push from these multiple leaves working all their way down. So this is where we ultimately end up going. So I think we pulled this one apart well enough that there's really not going to be any surprises that warrant an animation yet. We'll save that for what I'm sure you're all waiting for later in the episode. So instead, let's just send this guy over to the range and see how Mae does with him.
Up to mighty London came an Irishman one day. As the streets are paved with gold, sure everyone was gay. Singing songs of Piccadilly, Strand and Leicester Square. Till Paddy got excited, then he shouted to them there. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long way to Tipperary, but my heart's there. As he wrote a letter to his Irish Malio, saying, "Receive it right and let me know if I make mistakes in spelling Molly dear," said he. It's a long way to go. It's a long way.
Thank you, Mae, for your dedication to trying to put cartridges in this rifle. We'll see more about that in a moment. But first, I want to go over several key complaints against this gun, or rather, concerns? Well, anyway, things that cropped up during the trials and were still cropping up during its service. There was a fear the thin barrel would hurt accuracy. The sight radius was also debated, although oddly they kept wanting to walk the rear sight further up the barrel. Also, the recoil was much sterner compared to the long rifle. The first two of these points would dog the short magazine Lee-Enfield until World War II. Initial production for this gun would be quite slow, because they were still working out kinks. They were adding extra springs, like another one in the handguard. They were tightening down screws and repositioning little bits and bobs. They nipped off that lead ring on the magazine because you're not supposed to take the magazine off anyway unless you're cleaning the gun at this point. I don't know why we kept it that long. Just stuff like that. So eventually everything gets ironed out and they start rolling into production. But big change in this period would be that aggressive depth rifling. Well, they found that they were having inaccuracy problems again, like with the long Lee, and ultimately tracked it down, surprise, surprise, to the fact that the tops of their rifling were getting wider apart near the barrel, and it was unsupported at the muzzle right at that critical moment, and it's just throwing a bad football. So they would go ahead and parallel out the rifling all the way down at the top. They would, until 1917, keep the progressive depth boring. So in other words, the deep part of the rifling, the groove, that was going to get progressively deeper for a number of years, but the tops, oh no, they've got to stay parallel because they have to support the bullet that's already been, compressed down by the initial rifling pattern. I don't know why this was a surprise, but anyway. So that got fixed. In addition, these guns are very common to see without a magazine cutoff, mostly because The Navy was the ones requesting them. Really, the Army was done with the magazine cutoff, and it wouldn't really return until like 1906, when the Land Army's like, actually, I guess fine, we'll take the magazine cutoff again. I cannot track down why this goes back and forth. I mean, they keep going, do we really need this thing? We're spending money making this thing. And the Navy, yes, the Navy goes, yeah, we want that thing. So that was part of their doctrine. And then just a handful of like cavalry or various other special troops would go, I kind of want one too. And then they just decide to bring it all back around again. So if you have a Mark I with no magazine cutoff, but just the slot, don't worry about it. It's probably fine. Now, in order to use the existing stocks of old rifles, the previous Lee-Metfords and Enfields would be converted to the new pattern. This required significant modification and refitting of new parts. Interestingly, the original bolts were also modified, including fitting the charger guide on old heads. A small number of early single-stack Metfords were converted to the pattern, including modification to a double-stack magazine. This proved to be extremely costly and time-intensive and was abandoned. It's curious that these Mark I conversions were only recognized after the Mark IIs were approved. Now, I didn't want to confuse things last episode, so here is our missing charger loader. This is the India pattern, an attempt to easily bring the existing long rifles in India into a charger loading platform. It was approved in February of 1905 and had been developed at home in England. So initially there would be a regular Mark I and an India pattern Mark I. So with the introduction of the charger bridge, everything that uses this particular clip system is going to retroactively be called India pattern. Alright, so we got our new short rifle. We're catching up some old guns to work with the same pattern, the same ammunition. Things are going good. We made one big batch of changes in early production. That's fine. Didn't need to change designation, but other changes are still piling up, other wishes, and so I think it's time to go ahead and seal up a new designation for this gun. This time we've added back a butt plate trap, which is now made out of brass, and we're going to go ahead and throw a pull-through and oiler in there. We don't want to carry it on our belt anymore. The rear sling swivel is now fitted by 2 screws instead of just being screwed in and of itself. We've increased the depth at the front of the magazine to further help with loading that thing from a stripper clip, and that complicated pull and turn firing pin lock is now replaced by a simple set screw. So you need a screwdriver. Plus, once again, the sharp edges were rounded up so nobody gets an ouchie. Again, we'd convert long rifles to this pattern. They would be named Mark II Star converted. Now, the SMLE Mark I Star would be the last rifle for Sparkbrook, as they were sold to BSA, who did not keep them running rifles. Very few Sparkbrook examples of this pattern exist, so it didn't last long. This would also be the first standard Lee-Enfield for the factory in Ishapur, India, although only 3,000 were completed. Now, the Mark I Star pattern would serve pretty well for a few years, but again, little problems are starting to creep in. Like I said, the handguard sight protector is a weak arrangement. And, like we easily saw, this particular style of clip feeding with these little floaty bits, that's just asking for problems. And they're getting looser and harder to work with and just plain snapping off on the regular. And the third, less likely issue is that rear sight, which has all those little fine adjustments, is painfully complicated to manufacture and therefore expensive and still a little hard to use. So I wonder if we can't do a little bit better. Well, the new superintendent at Enfield would oversee Joseph Speed develop a whole new rugged and simpler rear sight, this time using a U-notch paired with a bladed front sight. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So while we're at it, playing with the handguard, playing with the clip loading, playing with the front sight, we'll go ahead and dust off every other little thing we can. We'll change up the front sight protector and other little bits. Let's just get it all out of the way at once and finally settle into a perfected short magazine Lee-Enfield. And with that, we end up with this, the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III. Let's go look it in the pretty light box. Still at 44.5 inch long and now weighing 8.6 pounds, chubbed up a bit, this guy still carries 10 rounds of .303 and a detachable box magazine. So, out with the old, sorry fella, let me just kinda, hey, and in with the new. Alright, so this, as all of you are probably aware, is the Mark III, and I know what some of you are probably wondering, which is, where's the Mark II? Well, when they went to look at naming this thing, they realized they already had named the converted long rifle the Mark II, And they'd already advanced through a couple versions of that gun, and let's just not confuse everybody. Let's just skip straight to Mark III. We don't have one of those on the books. Done. And then when we convert our long rifles to this pattern, we'll call those Mark IV converted. So if you see something that looks just like this, but it's made out of an older gat, Mark IV converted. All right, so there are a number of improvements in this gun, so I think we can go ahead and skip to the chase and take a closer look. All right, so once more, mostly same as before. We have the bolt system. We still, by the way, have our long-range sight and dial plate. While I'm on that side of the action, before we go any further forward, last time I didn't really show you guys the safety, and I'm sorry. So let's just go ahead and take a look at that. With our cocking piece back, let's say, as if we're going to fire, half cock now, full cock. This guy can be flicked back, whoop. And what that's done is, as we've done that half turn, we've gone into the action like a screw, and we've set pressure down on this pin and another pin down in there. This guy is locking up the bolt handle, so there's a shelf in there and he can't rise. You'll see more of this in the animation. And the other one has set into the cocking piece so that it can't come forward when I pull that trigger. So no bango. All right, let's get her back to live fire, not that there's anything in it, and pop her back around to see where our big difference is. Because from the previous model, we no longer have a finicky bit here. Instead, we have a very large, sort of bulbous shape that's been added over the top of the receiver. Frankly, I find it a bit ugly. Sorry guys, it's just been riveted on there. But mechanically, it's genius because now we have a fixed, rigid stripper clip platform. So this is our charger bridge. And the good thing is we've now tied the receiver together. So this is look, we have a pathway straight through our receiver, right? No full bridge at the back, okay? This is split bridge receiver. Well, with this guy, we get some of that full bridge strength back. So we're tying the middle of the action back together. This is adding rigidity, it's a good thing. In addition, they've also made a cut right in here so that you can get your thumb down in there while you're loading from the charger. Previously, we had that rise right there. That made it pretty difficult, and it was guaranteed to bend back and over a long thumbnail. So, still got our magazine cut off and on, depending. And at the front, they've gone ahead and made some modification to sort of lighten up and especially open up that front sight protector, letting more light in. At the rear sight, we're going to see a very improved, simplified model in terms of manufacture, although I find it a bit odd in terms of usability. So we have our push button and adjust tangent. So I'm trying to do this where you guys can see, but we can adjust our range there, and we can adjust our windage with this big knob, which we can read off of some markings right about there. Sorry guys, I know that's not easy for you. Now, the way to walk this gun, because remember that used to have that knob under here, they've moved it over to what is sort of like a worm gear on the side, although you can't just sit here and crank on this. It doesn't work very well. Instead, you have to push the button and rotate to the next column of sort of serrations. Now, each of these sets of serrations is offset by 5 yards up and down this slide. So there's 10 columns, so you get up to 50 yards of walk in either direction. So you can walk it back up to 50 yards, or you can go to the next mark down and walk it forward by 50. But the idea is that you can walk up to all of these measurements or off of all these measurements for 100 yards. I'm not sure how much use this got because it is very hard to perceive. Like you walk it in, you drop it in, and you have to read how far you are off your line. It's not a very easy, quick read, especially in battlefield conditions. This feels more like you're taking the time to do some, target rifle shooting. But it's there and it's an option, and I can understand why you might want to include it. Ultimately, it feels like you could have gotten away without this guy whatsoever, like most military rifles don't have anyway. But overall, again, solid design, strong improvements. One of the biggest things on this gun, as we're going to see in a moment, is that they went ahead and winded up the magazine again, giving us some more room at the front, and that proves to be fairly critical. Now, this isn't just a new rifle. They went so far as to adopt a new bayonet. This 17-inch sword-style bayonet was likely inspired by the earlier Elco sawback for the Martini rifle. And of course, it goes back to that earlier 17-inch trial bayonet where they realized, no, we were wrong, we should have gone with the longer one. One final thing while we're looking up close is this rear sight protector is much thinner and lighter, and yet mounted to the lower forestock, making it far more rigid and unlikely to deform or displace, and allowing this to therefore be damaged. And even if you, by the way, if the previous one didn't allow it to be damaged, it just fell off, that's still irritating. You got to replace those on a large scale. That's costly. So this is a beautiful improvement as well. All right, with all that walkthrough, I think we can finally take a look at the internals with an animation. This should all seem pretty familiar, but with the addition of a charger bridge. Loading up from a stripper clip, we'll also see our new magazine spring in action. The big mechanical difference here is the safety, which when turned screws deeper into the action, locking up both the cocking piece and the bolt. Also, don't forget we now have a new two-stage trigger at work. You can see the take-up and the release. All right, let's get this over to Mae.
Now I was weaned on cucumber and on my wedding day, when the fun was over and the guests had gone away, my old darling said to me, you must be hungry, Joe. Is there anything you fancy? I said, fancy, don't you know? I like pickled onions, I like pickled lily, pickled cabbage is alright with a bit of cold meat on Sunday night. I can go to market, but what I do prefer is a little bit of cucumber, little bit of cucumber. I went flying through the air with my old college chum. Suddenly he said to me, we're bound for kingdom. Have you anything on your brain before you wear a crown? I began to shake and said, write this confession down. I like pickled onions, I like pickled lily, pickled cabbage is alright with me on Sunday night. I can go to Mauser, but what I do prefer is a little bit of cucumber, little bit of cucumber. Several years of married life have brought me lots of joys. I don't know many girls, but think there's 14 boys. When the last one came to town, he fairly turned me head. He was more with the cucumber, and the first word that he said was, I like pickled onions, I like pickled lily, pickled cabbage is alright with bubble and sweet on Sunday night. I can go to my aunt's, but what I do prefer, little bit of cucumber. To the Lord Mayor's banquet I went in one foggy day. When I saw the grub, it took my... I like pickled lily, pickled cabbage is alright with a bit of cold meat on Sunday night. I can go to Martyrs, but what I do prefer...
You know, thank you, Mae, for your endurance, because a lot of people might not realize this. We don't just walk out and film one rifle at a time. That would be wasteful. So that particular day, we were trying to get through some loaners, and I think we moved 10, 12 long guns on the range. So I'm sure her shoulders were screaming by the time we got around to even filming that little segment. So, moving on, the Mark III would introduce a new factory, because it would be the first for Australia. Production of the SMLE Mark III would begin in Lithgow in February of 1912 and carry on well beyond the war we're discussing today. So at this point, I need to clear up a couple odd variants before we get into the meat and potatoes again. The Navy would do their own upgrade to the Mark I to incorporate some desirable aspects of the Mark III, but this was not a complete conversion. They kept their original charger system, but picked up improvements in the sights, slings, and magazine. There would also be a very special Mark I Double Star IP India pattern, converting old long rifles into exactly this gun. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting because it must have been an amazing rework process because they did not save anything of the original make except maybe the receiver and bolt body components. But we're not going to go into that much detail today. Instead, once again, I have to recommend you to our friend Ian, who has taken the time to walk through one of these. Now, this would also be the pattern rifle that introduced the Mark 7 cartridge, and so another conversion that went on, well, after this gun's adoption, but before the next model we want to talk about, would be the actual version of this guy, which is a Mark 1 star, 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 triple star, because, like I said, this was updated for the Mark 7 ammunition. And I know what you're thinking on that note, which is that I have skipped a lot of the ammunition story for these guns, and frankly, it requires its own study to get into the nitty-gritty, but let's just do a bird's eye. When we left off on ammo development, we were on the 303 Mark II cartridge. Well, this full jacket cartridge had a habit of passing all the way through, well, the natives, which didn't always outright stop and or kill them. As a matter of fact, some of them even had the indignity to survive after being shot. Well, the solution to that problem came from one Neville Bertie Clay, which I guess I might be having right, because that seems pretty spellable. Neville Bertie Clay. Anyway, this guy worked out at the Indian Ordnance Factory in Dum Dum, which is a beautiful name, gentlemen. Now, his solution to the problem was, let's just not jacket the whole bullet. We'll leave the tip soft-pointed, which is fairly familiar to anybody that does any hunting these days, but this created a mushrooming effect. It's an expanding round. I mean, we all know about this from hollow points. And as a matter of fact, as the British walked through Mark III, Mark IV, Mark V, that's where they went. They went to a standard hollow point full-size round, which was extremely effective and to many nations extremely horrifying. So it would be banned by the Hague Convention in 1899, which meant that they then had to go back temporarily to their Mark II cartridge, which caused them to go, well, hold on, we can't just go back to the old cartridge, that looks silly. Let's go ahead and come up with a new one. So they did a whole trials process and ultimately found the best possible combination of factors, which was the Mark II cartridge with a slightly thinner jacket. I mean, it was so close that it didn't, you could have called it Mark II Star, but then they felt like that would be so embarrassing to have gone through all this and then come back and say we've adopted what was already declared an inferior cartridge. So we're going to call this Mark VI and reintroduce it in 1904 and clap our hands and pretend nobody just noticed that. But real progress would come in 1910, and the British would introduce their version of the light and fast Spitzer bullet. This is the Mark VII cartridge we mentioned last time, and it would remain through the war. Now at this point in the story, it would be pretty hard to talk about the serviceability of the Mark III. How did I do that? Okay. There we go. Mark III. God, they look a lot alike, guys. It's hard to talk about the serviceability of the Mark III Lee-Enfield because up until now, it's a peacetime rifle. And as a matter of fact, it almost remained a peacetime rifle for the entirety of its service life if it were not for a certain conflict that we are not naming just yet. As a matter of fact, as we're closing in on 1914, it really looks like it's going to be replaced with a Mauser-derived system. The big points of consideration here were weaknesses in the Lee magazine, poor sight radius, and busy line of sight thanks to that charger bridge and protectors. Plus, they wanted to move to a heavier barrel and front-locking action so that they could try out a smaller bore, really high-velocity cartridge. That guy, that guy. See it? That's him. Anyway, on the cusp of what would become the P14, which we have another episode for, we're really looking at this rifle and we need to come to some sort of hard conclusions. Now I know a lot of you are in love with the Lee-Enfield, but let's be honest for just a moment. This gun has been revised over and over and over again since 1889, and it's a lot to constantly go back and change something that is, you know, walking the globe in the hands of the Army, Navy, and everybody else. The universal short rifle concept part of it is great, but that means that it has to be so dang perfect. You can't just replace it in small batches. And we'll see there's other guns out there that are contemporaries of this one that did not require the constant, every 2, 3, 4 years changes that this gun required. And at this point, yes, we are tighter, we're refined. We know what we're looking for, but it's still a hodgepodge. I mean, if you really stop and look at the elements of this gun, you have this sort of thin, flimsy, detachable magazine because you were supposed to be able to swap it out. But now you just have it. You're not using the benefit, but you're getting the negative of it being able to dent and damage. And the same thing with this sort of overall rear locking action seems fine, and yes, it'll do well in the battle, don't get me wrong, but we like higher pressure, really flat shooting cartridges now, and we're going down to smaller diameter. We haven't yet gone to the intermediate revolution, which would change that need for all that locking strength. But at the time, this is sort of a weak receiver for what people perceive to be the next step, and so on and so forth, with extra stuff lumped on here and there. It's half advanced, half retro. We're not really sure where we're going with this. We're really considering what then would be the P13. Watch the episode if you guys really want to get into detail on that. When, unbeknownst to us, even though it was right on the horizon, suddenly in our face is the fact that war were declared. That's right, folks, the Great War, the war to end all wars, except for that other war and a bunch of, it didn't work out. We really like war, guys. But the most devastating conflict the Earth had ever seen up until that point was on, and attrition was the name of the game, so there was no time to turn around and adopt a new cartridge, a new rifle. It looks like the peacetime almost dropped baby was now being kitted out with a bayonet and helmet. So how'd this thing do toddling onto the battlefield is going to be our next big question. But first, we need to talk about whether or not we even have enough of these things, because at the beginning of the war, Britain had in inventory roughly 750,000 rifles, which sounds like a lot until you look at the casualty rates on those big European battlefields. And not all of those rifles were yet converted to Mark 7 ammunition, so you couldn't just toss them all into the mix right away. Now, at first this didn't seem like such a big problem, especially with production of 8,000 rifles a month, until people started dying. And then, even after people died, when they went to recoup their equipment, turns out it was all smashed by artillery. So the cost on rifles in inventory was way higher than anybody expected, and so manufacturing would have to be dialed up to 11. BSA, LSA, Enfield, Ishapore, and Lithgow would get to cranking, and production would eventually catch up. But the initial lag and losses would mean Britain would have a lot of ground to cover and need outside help. So we'll see guns like the P14 and Ross imported, and usage of seized guns like the Yarisaka and even Chilean Mausers. Alright, we have some pretty strong production goals, and there's a lot of little operations on this gun that we could probably get rid of to speed it up. So we're going to look at some lightning cuts and little, breathe holes, things like that. Just stuff where we've saved a little bit of weight at the cost of a little more time, and we're going to go ahead and get rid of those. And that frees up more workers to go ahead and spend extra time producing extra guns. BSA, what are you doing? We are still pretending to need those. Yep, around September of 1915, BSA restructured to improve workflow, and as part of that, omitted adding the magazine cutoff, a part that had already been removed and reintroduced several times before. They would actually get in trouble with the War Office briefly before someone realized how stupid this was. That's right, we have finally gotten rid of the good old appendix, that magazine cutoff. Well, sort of. We've gotten rid of it in England. We'll still see it produced in India and especially Australia for a time, and then not, and then the thing would come back after the war. They kept putting it back on the gun because it was part of the routine, the training. And I just can't imagine the justification for needing to constantly fit this part over and over again. Anyway, the takeaway here is many people believe that removing this was the reason to go from Mark III to the next gun. And it's not. As a matter of fact, you can find these on Mark III stars all day long. It just depends. There's no specific model with or without this. So, what did change the gun over to the next model would be the removal of the windage adjustment on the rear sight and the removal of the long-range dial/volley sights, which would ultimately result in what most people have in their homes. This, the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III Star. Same length, nearly the same weight, we've got a rifle that's perfectly serviceable, but a lot simpler to make. Again, 303, 10 rounds, stripper clip. Approved in January of 1916, although it had already been in production for some months, this, like I said, is the Mark III Star. Now, I hate to disappoint, but it does not really warrant another trip to the range. It functions just like the Mark III, so no more Mae until we get to the end of the episode. Sorry. Now, let's go ahead and skip right into taking a look at the differences in this gun from this one, which are not... There's a variety. So let's just see, and then I might even pull in another example. So, zooming in, boom, a rifle gap. So, let's just take a look real quick. We are almost entirely the same gun all the way down the line. The key differences here are the much simplified rear sight without the windage dial adapter. And, importantly, all along this side, no long-range dial sight. And as dial sights were damaged from here forth, they would just go ahead and remove them and eventually restock the rifles going into World War II and beyond, so that you ultimately always end up with more and more Mark III Stars, which makes pure Mark IIIs extremely hard to come by. As a matter of fact, this one is technically a Mark III Star that somehow got refitted back to a Mark III very quickly because it's got the star peened back out of it, even though technically, and we'll see this in a minute, this should have been a Star right from the get-go. So, if we compare the two, we're going to see a few other little changes. As a matter of fact, instead of trying to get both up here, let's do this. At various times, different things would appear and disappear from the Star pattern. So, these are not absolutely required for a Mark III Star, but are common on them. One, this guy from the pure Mark III, our unit marking disc, would disappear. Instead, it just be flush there, would. Up here, where we have our swivel loop that's nice and milled in, that would get replaced with a simple wire loop. I'll show you one in a second. And then you'll see things eventually down the road, like this upper stacking swivel being filled in, and even simplifications to the nose cap. And other fits and finishes just sort of changing. The milling disappears from the protectors, stuff like that. So let me get this Mark III out of the way and get a Mark III Star in there. See, no milling on the protectors. Both loops are gone on this one. The wire's been popped off over the years. And no unit disc mark. And if we look at a much, much later gun, this thing coming from the 50s out of India, we'll see a gun that's probably about as simple and crude as you can get. We have a simple wire loop. The reason the wire loop was kept, by the way, is so that you could put a canvas cover over the action and attach it to the gun. Thick bodied stock that has not been sanded down or fitted very well. Later style cocking piece, talk about that in a moment. And then up front, we've just completely ditched the provision for our stacking swivel. This is not a World War I thing. Oh, by the way, look how square. This is way out into the 50s, but just to sort of show you the ultimate sort of end of the Mark III Star is that things just kept getting more and more simple without necessarily getting a change in designation. Now, let me get some of these put away for a second before I go any further. One little piggy, two, okay, Mark III, this is getting confusing, guys. Anyway, on this particular gun, we also see the sort of ceiling of getting away from having that easy detach firing pin. So if we go back in, now we'll get this bolt out and we'll take a look at the big difference. This is actually harkening back to the old system where you needed a special tool to get in there. So if we, actually I'll just go ahead and get the bolt head off to save confusion because it is no longer working any sort of magic on the firing pin. And there, okay, we're out. That guy's stuck at the moment because what we have to do is remove this set screw at the rear, and these would eventually get, you know, flushed out, but this is an older style, so we'll get that screw out of there. And we now need a special tool. Now this is a modern production one, but same idea. We just got a open cylinder with a pair of pokies. They're gonna go in there and catch on some notches on that firing pin, and we're gonna spin and keep a little back pressure so we don't tear up that thread as we get where we're coming out. Come on, baby. There we go. Cocking piece is free. We're under spring pressure, but not a lot. And firing pin and spring are now free. And so the relationship there is that right there. Now, honestly, yeah, it's a little bit nicer in the field to be able to take it apart without a special tool. But by the time you get to the slotted screw in the rear as the keeper, instead of that complicated push or pull button, rather, by the time you have a slotted screw, you need a screwdriver to do that part. So it's not much more to ask somebody to carry one of these, which can have both features in one. Ultimately, it's weird to me, but having done both systems, this one's still easier because the depth of the threading for the bolt head are not necessarily equal to the same threading and position for the cocking piece, so you constantly have to reset the bolt head and work it back and forth. And then you have to time it out so that your bolt head's tightening down just as your firing pin is getting threaded to the right position. That takes a little bit of tweaking. Making it two separate operations really makes it easier to sort of just go ahead and accomplish. All right, so all of this, make sure you don't lose anything, guys. All of this would ultimately result in a rifle that is much easier to manufacture. But is that really enough? I mean, you're talking about production for the entirety of what is now the Great War. I mean, it's astronomical, and yes, we're cruising on up in terms of production capacity at BSA and LSA, and now we have India, and we have Australia. We still have our factory at Enfield, but the best thing possible would be, what if we could go ahead and get another factory going, up and running? And so two Birmingham gun manufacturers, along with a London businessman, would approach the government and receive a grant for £60,000 in January of 1915. Now, this would ultimately result in the Standard Small Arms Company, who were supposed to produce full rifles for the British government. But as you can tell, assembling these things is a little tricky. And so they ultimately would fail at their task of building a complete rifle. Instead, they'd have to just manufacture parts that could then be used and assembled at Royal Enfield. As a matter of fact, you can find SSA marked receivers, although final markings on the wrist were applied at Enfield. Despite not having to do entire rifles, SSA was still incredibly slow, and it seemed management was the problem. So the Ministry of Munitions would buy them out and rename to National Rifle Factory No. 1 in June of 1918. So in addition to SSA stamps, you can also find NRF. Now, another firearms manufacturer of famous name, Greener, would step into the same fray, and in September of 1915, they would also try to go ahead and start producing whole guns. And again, it's trickier than it looks to get right. So ultimately, their firm would also end up being a parts supplier, among many smaller suppliers as well. These guys would focus on stocks and barrels, not necessarily receivers like SSA. So you don't necessarily see any Greener marks on your Enfields. But the whole thing combined, when you have these not necessarily smaller but less competent factories, less capable factories, they're fueling parts that include receivers and barrels and stocks all the way to Enfield for final assembly and fitting. Well, that program becomes known as the pedal scheme. And so if you find an SSA or NRF marked rifle, they're usually called pedaled scheme rifles. But just because you don't see those particular marks, that doesn't mean that you didn't receive some of these pedaled parts, and they help to really rapidly increase production. Now, we've already seen a lot of evolution on the cocking piece over the history of these rifles, but there's still one more variant to go. You see, in August of 1916, they would authorize the simplification of that sort of complicated shape into really just a vertical fin with 3 serrations on either side. This radically simplified production and saved a few man-hours. I should also mention one other variant of the SMLE that would exist during the war, the grenade firing model, which uses a detachable cupped grenade launcher and copper banding. You would use the gun by placing it on the ground upside down and pulling the trigger. The lack of soft-yielding people meat meant that stocks took a lot more of a beating, and so they would often splinter. Now, in the field, this wasn't a huge problem just yet, because it was kind of infrequent at that point. But where they were training and had to do it repeatedly with rifles, they were splintering fairly often. So they needed a potential solution, at least at the training level. And what they would come up with is the GF, or later EY, rifle. Now, GF obviously is for grenade firing, and EY is for nobody seems to know, because it's been said that it's the initials of the creator. I've heard extra yoke as a very likely explanation. I don't know. I haven't seen it solidly written down. Maybe somebody will turn up the paperwork on that later. But what they did is they simply took copper wire, wrapped it around, and soldered it so that the stocks in these two key weak places would not burst. They would also later go ahead and put a thick stock bolt right through there, really reinforce this thing, again, so that it could be used upside down and with a cup launcher that I don't happen to have handy. Now, once more, this is a small variation that we are not focusing on today, but it has been covered by another popular religious icon. Hallowed be thy name. Now, of course, these would work well for training and then move on to the front line because, hey, it works and it's easy to do. There would also, on occasion, you'll find steel band versions where they're clamped down. Same effect. I have not broken down which came first or why, or when, or anyway. That's a whole subset, and we've got more ground to push, because when we're talking about our Mark III or Mark III Star rifle in the war, we got to talk about its serviceability. Now, these guns were almost replaced on the eve of battle. I mean, not down to the wire, but they were really on their way out the door in the next 5 years or so when, well, like I said, war were declared. No bump that time, sorry guys. But you're going in with something that you were about to give up. Are you going to regret it? Is it going to turn out poorly for you? Well, the truth is, combat saved the design, as the Enfield was ultimately reliable enough for the Great War, which is high praise. Its larger capacity magazine was an obvious advantage, and the extra time spent on good Spitzer cartridges and clean sights obviously helped too. Yes, the P14 and the Ross were more accurate and preferred for sniping, but the SMLE was handier, more nimble, and ultimately most engagements were well under its still very effective range. The slick bolt and short throw made it fast to operate, and as the war progressed, throwing more lead counted for a lot. The rear locking action, while weak overall, was fairly resistant to dirt and fouling because it didn't invite it deep into the receiver, and grit rarely locks up an Enfield. This made the Enfield way more rugged than some of its fairer counterparts. And perhaps best of all, the adoption of a universal short rifle was the perfect pre-war decision, as this greatly simplified supply, production, and training in the Empire. Now, if you guys are watching this, I probably don't have to tell you that this is a legendary icon of 2 world wars. Now, the number 4 would come out for World War II, so this is definitely more associated with World War I, and with its unique profile and nose cap and odd bulbous features, it stands out. Everybody recognizes the Enfield, and most people have a respect for it inherently. Whether they've shot one or not, it has a name that precedes it. Now, that's not to say it's perfect, and it's not to say that it's my favorite rifle of the war, as many of you were hoping that it would be, because there are real difficulties with this gun that make it not necessarily the ace of aces, but in terms of serviceability, in terms of ruggedness and getting out there and doing its job, this is a gun that has benefited from decades of refinement and perfecting of a much older action. I mean, this is the actual Lee action is very dated by the time of the war. But you are not going to find anyone to complain about this particular rifle at that time. Unless, of course, you find a German who knows the Lee-Enfield's dark, insidious, and inhumane secret. You see, that whole dum-dum expanding bullet notion really poisoned the well of public opinion, and the Germans would repeatedly claim Britain was using hollow point ammunition on the battlefield. As a matter of fact, they would claim that the hole created in the magazine cutoff latch, formed when the flat metal was folded over to create a thumb tab, was actually an insidious device placed there to circumvent the Hague Convention. They believe British troops used this feature to create their own illegal ammunition. This accusation really didn't get a lot of ground though, because, well, it's Germany. I mean, reprisals in Belgium gas warfare, and unrestricted submarine attacks. Watch the Great War, guys. There's a lot there. But anyway, going back to the development of this gun, while we're talking about the trenches, let's go ahead and talk about one other thing that the British tried, which was that in April of 1918, you would see, sort of last minute, a 20-round detachable box magazine appearing. And I do not have one today. Roughly 100,000 were made, but they're still quite rare today, so it seems at some point in history, many were disposed of or somehow abused. But these would make it to France and into the trenches, so they were actually present. And the theory behind them was not to just plop, 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 plop 20-round magazines. Instead, what they thought is, if we can get them a 20-rounder, it's not that we want him to shoot more or faster or anything like that. It's that we don't want him to open the action as often. Instead, we'd prefer to give him his 10-rounder, and then when it runs out, we'll drop the mag, take the 20, put it in, and then he'll get through that 20, and if he needs to, then he can open up and load from stripper clips. The idea is to try not to, in the heat of battle, to be introducing stripper clips, because you may also introduce mud and muck. Overall wartime production from Enfield would be just over 2 million rifles. BSA would manage 1.5. London Small Arms would squeak over 350,000. Lithgow would manage roughly 90,000 from the notes I could find. And Ishapur, well, there's a lot of conflicting numbers. Nothing has been written down that I have found that's locked, but I'm going to give a rough guesstimate, ballpark of 60,000 rifles or so. I can't give any promises here, folks. Now, for those of you who are not good with numbers, that's a lot of gats. These guns, honestly, don't need any more fluffing from me. We definitely need to talk to Mae and get her opinion and find a few negatives. Sorry, guys. But overall, I don't think I need to dress up the service history for this gun. So I think we can go ahead and wrap this one out, if not for the fact that I know I'm going to get a bunch of messages from a lot of you going, but Othais, I thought that was the #1 Mark III. Well, that convention was not brought about until 1926, well after the war, and so we are blind to it. And if you'd like me to address it now, then you can give up hope on a post-World War I Lee-Enfield episode, can't you? Smart guy. Once more, not quite same as before, we've made room for Mae, and count them, two of these British Gats. Now, I think it's a little bit fair when we're looking at these two guns to say that the overall dimensions and weight are nearly identical, the handling characteristics, the trigger is identical. The difference is really going to be in the adjusting of the sights, but then again, this one, like we said, was updated to have the same rear U and front blade as that one, so if we're shooting at, under 100 yards like we were, there's no difference there. Really what it's going to come down to between the two of these is how we loaded that clip. So we'll save that part for a little bit later and just sort of talk about what everybody's most familiar with, which is the Mark III, which is going to apply to this other than loading. So let's put this away for 1 second, and then we'll turn to Mae and we'll ask her to start, as usual, with the ergonomics.
All right, guys. So if you all saw the last episode, pretty much what I said before still holds true. But the key difference is, like we mentioned before, it's a little bit shortened up. The balance is actually a little bit better. I do prefer the balance on this guy. It is still slightly muzzle heavy, but in particular for this guy, I do actually prefer it because it did actually help mitigate some recoil there, which was nice. Now, I didn't really get a chance to talk about this last time around, so I'm just going to mention it right here. It's not a difference, it's just a nice feature I like with these guys. When you're working the bolt, it just kind of deposits your hand right here at the trigger, which is really nice. I do appreciate it. So if anything, you're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, and it feels like 4, there's no extra step. There's no extra 5 step. It just deposits your hand right there. You're ready to go. It's very smooth, it's in the right spot, and I do appreciate it. I didn't mention that last time, so I wanted to make sure I took a second to say that this time around. And then the last thing, difference-wise, is the safety on this guy. Now, I did mention before, with the long leads, I did prefer that safety where it's on the right-hand side. I'm able to easily manipulate it with my thumb, not having to really adjust my grip. Whereas with this one, I basically got to take my thumb around in order to manipulate it on this guy. Now, it is still an easy safety to maneuver. I'm still able to do it with one finger, which is nice, but I've got to alter my grip in order to do it, so I kind of don't like that. But that's about it. Otherwise, ergonomics-wise, it's still neat. It's got a lot of weird stuff going up the top, but we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah, there are a lot of biddly bobs on this gun. Anyway, what about when you pull the trigger, when you shoot a short magazine Lee-Enfield?
Now hold on, sir. Before we get to actually pulling the trigger, I've got to aim my sights. And in case you guys haven't noticed, like I mentioned just now, there's a lot going on up here at the top. I mean, I've got these big wings. There's like, the sight's a little bit bulkier. I've got the charger bridge. Everything's just kind of really busy up here. So like, you do have to take a second to be like, okay, where's my sight? All right, there it is. I mean, you're able to easily recognize the blade and the U in there, and there's still good, clean sights, but there's still just a lot going on. And I will say, the U on this one does feel like it's not quite as deep. Still easy to read, still great sights, just, it's very busy. But that's about it. Now, the trigger on this guy, it's very smooth, it's nice, the brake is there, it's clean. Everything about this trigger is pleasant. Me personally, I still prefer that single stage trigger. I just like it when it's a smooth pull through all the way. There's no real perceivable like change in the trigger. It doesn't feel like I'm bumping any extra notches in the sear. Like it's all there. Whereas with the two stage, there's just a little bit of extra feel going on in there. I guess it's just it's not quite as clean from my perspective, but still very nice, still very smooth, still appreciated that trigger, so it was still fantastic. Last but not least, the recoil. The recoil on this guy was practically nothing. I mean, it's still got a good bit of weight to it, and that little bit of weight up at the muzzle really helped to mitigate that recoil. I barely felt anything. Go watch that slow-mo. It's gonna barely show. No, seriously, but really, recoil was manageable. Anyone could handle it. I felt like I could easily control myself on the range with it.
You know, I saw that same recoil and I thought it was a little more potent than that, but as long as it felt comfortable, that means the other pieces of the ergonomics are there. Now, may I borrow that for a moment?
Fine.
One thing that I want to talk about in the sights while we're giving this thing a review is that despite the length of this gun, which is a short rifle but not a carbine, I want to point out one critical thing that I noticed anyway, which is that the rear sight is here, if you guys can spot that on the camera. The front sight is there, and some of you might have noticed our sight radius is actually shorter than it needs to be. We could probably scrape a couple more inches by getting rearward, even as a barrel-mounted sight. It's kind of odd, but in the development of this gun, we would see it moved all the way up to here in some of the tests. I mean, there really was this hesitation about opening up the sight radius because of fears of heat mirage and things like that. It ends up being kind of awkward that you could get just a little bit better performance out of this gun if you just walk that back. So whenever I look at a Lee-Enfield, and I can't help it, it's the way my mind is, it's always so odd to me about how almost middle position that rear sight is. But my opinion doesn't matter for much at this point in the show. So let me hand that back.
Thank you.
And we need to talk about the differences between that gun and this Mark I now, because these used two different charger loading systems. Now, most people are familiar with the bridge. This is that unusual sliding nib. So, would you like to give us sort of your perspective on both? Is there any way to sort of let you...
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
And then do I need to take one or you got it? Good? Okay.
All right, so before we get into it, guys, I first just want to say thank you so much for the multiple emails and comments about how we were loading these guys wrong. Guys, I promise you, we looked at military documents to make sure that we were loading things properly. We tried multiple different clips. We even just tried multiple different loading sets, like just to give it a shot. Ultimately, we ended up loading what felt best. And you know what? The charger loading Lee, the Mark I, they kind of still gave us some problems. The Mark III, however, it liked to eat rounds. And honestly, you can just see the difference is because of two things. One, the development of the magazine, and two, this charger bridge. Honestly, these two things combined in the Mark III made it fantastic for loading. But here, let me pass this to you for a second. So with the charger loader, the Lee just it didn't want to actually eat rounds that way. It wasn't initially designed for that, so of course it had problems. But with the Mark I, they thought, oh, we're going to slap this guy on. And you know what? Probably in its original like state when it wasn't like as old as it is now and the parts are worn and kind of moving around a bit, yeah, maybe it probably loaded fine. But for this guy, he was worn, he was moving around, you could even see it on video. I'm trying to stabilize the rounds, the clip, and this guy from moving around so much in order to actually load the rounds. And it wasn't easy. It didn't like doing it. It just didn't load them smoothly. Whereas the Mark III, it's got this solid charger bridge right here. The magazine has already been well developed. It loved feeding rounds. It did well. I mean, you saw on video, that was actually like our second take for this guy. It did fantastic. But if you have to spend hours practicing loading and hours poring over documents to make sure it's being loaded right, and then you have to spend 2 paragraphs explaining to someone how to properly load a gun, it's probably inherently not the best design. So in the Mark III, they made it this way because they had to work out the kinks because there were obviously problems with the previous models. But I'm guessing most of you guys who explained to us in paragraph after paragraph had Mark IIIs and that's what y'all were practicing on, which I can understand how loading these is like a breeze. It's just, when you go back to the older stuff, they just didn't do as well. That's all.
Yeah, I'm sorry folks, we obviously hit a nerve because everybody and their brother is a Lee-Enfield expert. And we have a sample size for each model of exactly one. One worn Mark I, one worn charger loading Lee-Enfield, and a butt ton of choices for Mark III and Mark III stars, well, at least for Mark III stars. And plus those bridges are much firmer and from ground up, they were designed to take that bridge. And the long charger loader conversion, whether worn or just because it was never designed to have that to begin with and then they riveted it on, look, it's a delicate balance, especially when you're dealing with a rimmed cartridge in a system that does not have a positive interrupter of sorts. I mean, the Mauser is a single stack with a rim cartridge, and as we are going to see, that gun has a mechanism to deal with the problem because it's so pronounced. This gun, the mechanism behind it, is basically the way they fall back a bit as they're coming out the clip, sets them up in a proper stack. Well, if you get sloppy in your clip loading, you develop rim lock, which is a real potential problem on the Lee-Enfield system, which is why so many of you had the knowledge readily at hand about how to properly stack your clips. When you are down to having to really analyze your clip stack, I don't know where we're going with this. It doesn't seem like smart military technology. And I understand, contextually, they chose that, as we'll see later, in order to help with machine gun development. But that puts it to a limit on the rifle side of things. And then also later autoloaders are not going to be very happy about that rim either. Let's all just admit to ourselves that despite how much we love this gun, the rim cartridge was not ideal. Can we go that far? Because without the rim cartridge, everything else just works perfectly. Okay, so one other thing before we get into the final question. I know a lot of you at this point in the show are wondering, where's the Mad Minute? Where's the Mad Minute, Mad Minute, Mad Minute? I understand. Everybody that owns a Lee-Enfield has done a Mad Minute. We have not done a Mad Minute on any other gun so far, and this is a roughly comparative series. And honestly, a Mad Minute done well requires you to sit down and very definitively practice with that arm. So, once again, we are going to refer to our good friend over at British Muzzleloaders and invite you to go watch his Mad Minute. Alright, with that covered, let's go ahead and get our final question, which is, would you take one of these guys into battle? And I kind of know where we're going with an answer here, and so does most of the audience. So, let's go ahead and push you to give us a good ranking as to where you're at, and maybe let's find your top 5 so far of the show. Is this a good time, folks, to stop and get a top 5? Alright, let's do that.
Alright guys, so obviously there is no real question. I mean, if any of you are questioning at this point, did you watch the video? No, seriously. If I'm going to look at the two, I'm a little bit lukewarm on the Mark I. It's still a yes, but it's a lukewarm yes. Whereas the Mark III, yeah, this one definitely gets a hard yes. I mean, my performance was awesome with this guy. However, I do have to point out that everybody loves this gun, and yes, this one is decent, but it still had some real faults that we mentioned throughout the episode, and they do need to still, of course, be recognized. Like, everyone thought this one actually would end up becoming my number 1 slot, and it isn't. The number 1 actually for me would be the US 1917. That one was still the best performer I have shot so far to date for the series. Number 2, I'd probably put the Arisakas, specifically the Type 44, but the Arisakas probably get the number 2 slot. And then reaching into number 3 would be the Lee-Enfield, or possibly the Carcano.
Carcano. That's you're telling me that it's a contest neck and neck right now between Lee-Enfield and Carcano. Could you maybe break that down a little bit?
Okay, before any of you start commenting, guys, hear me out real quick. Seriously, this gun, the Lee-Enfield, yes, it is more polished. It's got more going on for it. It's been through the ringer, the tests, everything. Like, the Mark III has been made into like a better perfection of their original starting piece. However, when you look at the Carcano, it's very simple. It's able to withstand a good beating. Like, my performance with it was tight. It still had one of the best groupings out of everything I have shot so far for the series. So, I don't know. They're kind of about neck and neck for me.
Okay, I have one question. We're talking about the Carcano cavalry folding bayonet Mosquito 91, the short one. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I think I see her point. All right, nobody freak out yet. We'll get there in a moment. But out of the box, close your eyes and imagine for a second. Out of the box, we are dealing with 2 designs from roughly 1889 to 1891. One design is a 30 cal bore smokeless with a split bridge and rear locking lugs. Not unlike the Vetterli, I guess, if you think of it that way. Cock on close instead of cock on open, though. And then the other design is split bridge, and it has front locking lugs, which already sounds better, although our bolt handle's going through and acting as a auxiliary lug. That's cool, too. All right. And then one uses no loading system, but would later get a stripper clip sort of tack welded on. And the other one has a Mannlicher packet loading system, boom, right from the gate. And then one shooting, the other one, by the way, is shooting like a small bore high velocity 6.5, which is a very modern notion. Okay, I'm seeing this in paper. I get it. You can argue that at the conception, the Carcano was more advanced than the original Lee-Metford. I get that. Okay, and then what happens is the Carcano serves all the way to World War I with no changes, essentially, nothing. I mean, it's right out the gate. That gun is what they want it to be. I mean, maybe the tiniest of little adjustments to manufacture, but realistically, they're like, nah, this is working, it's running. But this gun goes from the long Lee-Metford all the way through. Well, we've done 2 hour-and-a-half long episodes to get to where we're this far. Well, this plus the Mark III Star. We just only have so many hands. All right, I kind of get it. The Carcano whole, right from adoption, was a much stronger system than the original Metford system. I know it's going to ruffle some feathers, but you got to admit, guys, the Carcano stayed the Carcano for a long time. But there's one downside of that I want you to consider before you solidify your number 3 slot, which is that the Carcano was never, well, not until we see in like the 30s. The Carcano in World War I did not get a Spitzer cartridge. It was still a bottlenose 6.5 and very weak. Does that change your mind at all for your number 3?
Yeah, I did kind of forget about that. So yeah, okay, Lee-Enfield gets number 3, Carcano's right under there at number 4.
Okay, whew, I thought we were going to have a riot. Although, food for thought. I had not considered that, and I am in a cold sweat worrying about what the comments are going to be. But it's a good consideration. Before anybody asks, what was number 5?
Actually, I have a soft spot for the Ross Mark III. It was just kind of cool.
Folks, I would like to warn you at this point that this show is absolutely subjective, and if you find yourself in a world war, we are not liable for your selection of military arms. I will have to sit down and come up with my own top 5 list when I'm not running all this and trying to pretend that Lee-Enfields don't exist after all the nightmares I've been having lately about these episodes. So, on that happy note, let's wrap this one up. So, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Hey everyone, update time. This set of episodes was brutally hard, so the next few are going to be a bit lighter on the clock, but still plenty heavy on research. Over the course of preparing 3 hours on one family of guns, we also managed to build a slight lead on our work and introduce a new show. So here I need to especially thank our team. Bruno the animator really stepped up, and Mark helped us keep a tight schedule on repairs. Jay was on ammo and along with May made up for any slack in my efforts. As always, we were able to lean on our support network of friends and loved ones like Dave Triana, Susie, and our mysterious and alluring Blackwell to keep our regular lives moving just a little bit smoother. These people, combined with our patrons, are the only reason I survived these 2 episodes. Still willing to make more. And with one more piece of thanks, I'd like everyone to take some extra time and a little bit of cash to donate over to the Royal Armouries if you can, as Jonathan Ferguson really did me a favor at the last minute to help flush out some details. And as before, if you like British gear, consider British muzzleloaders for more. Alright, thank you everyone for watching, and as always, if you know somebody that'd like it, please share us.